I'm Ben C.
I'm Dr. V, the medical legal guy.
Casual guy.
Yeah, so we're talking about a recent decision by the FDA that goes to warning physicians and women about the dangers of Depo-Provera. And this is a big aspect of the litigation. And why is this FDA warning important as it relates to this litigation?
So there's something called preemption, which basically is a legal concept that says if the federal government has preempted a state law, then you can't bring a case under that state law. And it's possible that preemption can result in the dissolution of claims. So that's basically the importance. But the argument was that, well, hey, if we had Pfizer, if we had told the federal government, the FDA, that we wanted a warning, okay, then they may not have allowed us to have a warning. And they went a step further and they said, hey, we sought approval of a warning from the FDA. And the FDA said no, okay, no warning. About a month ago, the FDA came out with a ruling, an order, and the FDA said, oh yes, you must put a warning label on Depo-Provera about meningioma. And indeed, there is one. So now, when they say it would be impossible to put a warning on because the FDA wouldn't allow it, they've allowed it.
We're going to talk about the warning that the FDA has ordered Pfizer to change the label to notify physicians of the risk of meningioma. So Ben, do you want to read the sections from the warning?
There are really two parts of the warning of the label change. Now, this is a 27-page document. We've talked about it before, and those are labels, also called instructions for use or use instructions. And if you now look at what the FDA said Pfizer must put under warnings and precautions, meningioma, discontinue Depo-Provera if meningioma is diagnosed. Monitor patients for signs and symptoms of meningioma. That's pretty straightforward. If a doctor has a patient that has a meningioma, stop Depo-Provera. And there are reasons for that in the literature. Then there's a second part of it, and it's section 5.3. Let me get to it here. And that is 5.4. This is in the product insert, the label, the packaging that goes with every injection of Depo-Provera. That doctor has that warning at their disposal. Meningioma. Cases of meningiomas have been reported following repeated administration of medroxyprogesterone acetate. That's Depo-Provera. Primarily with long-term use. Monitor patients on Depo-Provera for signs and symptoms of meningioma. Discontinue Depo-Provera if a meningioma is diagnosed. So that's kind of going back up to the top of the warnings. That's what part of this is about. The other part, though, is an indicator that cases of meningioma have been reported in the literature following repeated administration, and it says generally for long-term use. Well, long-term use in the pharmaceutical industry, long-term use could be anything over 6 months, could be anything over a year. And these studies sometimes will use that short period of time, 6 months or a year, to mean, okay, well, that's long-term use, right? So don't get the idea that they're saying generally takes 5 or 10 or 15 years. Long-term use can be a pretty short period of time.
Yeah. So when I look at this label, I see some issues. We're way past reported. Okay. So, and we're going to go through the history of
reported. If you read the British Medical Journal article that came out last year, and if you read that study by Dr. Rowland and others, it's way more than a sort of a case study or a few reports here and there. They'd studied 108,000 women and compared the women who took Depo-Provera or had the Depo-Provera injected in their bodies versus those who did not. And that's where they found close to a 600% more probability that a woman on Depo-Provera is going to develop a meningioma than if she had not had the Depo-Provera. So that's, as Dr. V says, that's a lot more than a reported case or two, which seems to be what the label's sort of suggesting. Few reports. Could it have been stronger? Yes. But is it something the company is required to warn about Depo-Provera and its association with meningioma? And the answer now is yes.
So in my view, it's kind of a weak warning. So we're going to go over the literature that kind of built up to this change. So we're going back to 2006, was the first indication.
20 years ago.
First indication that progestins have a relative risk for causing meningiomas, and explain why relative risk of 2 is important from a legal standpoint.
So let me explain what relative risk is. So relative risk is the associated risk of being on a pharmaceutical like Depo-Provera versus the risk as compared with someone that is not on the drug or has not taken the drug. If you have a relative risk that's 2 or higher, then there's no question about this association. Relative risk of 2 means you're doubling the risk. That is 100% increase in the risk. And if you got 100% increase in the risk, then legally that is an important distinction as opposed to just barely an association of pharmaceutical causing something.
So this article back in 2006 looked at birth control, types of birth control, and their associations with gliomas, which is a type of brain tumor, and meningiomas. And this article, 2006, showed that oral birth controls no increased relative risk of meningiomas. And when they combined the studies that looked at progestins that are embedded in IUDs and progestins that go underneath the skin and injections, when they group those all together, that relative risk is 2 for prolonged use over 5 years. But the kicker is the IUD progestins, that dose is a lot less than Depo-Provera.
Yes.
So they have progestins in like Mirena that are embedded in the IUD.
Birth control device.
Yes. So it's a form of birth control. So back in 2006, the pharmaceutical companies knew or should have known that progestins cause meningiomas. But if you look at the types, Depo-Provera has a much higher dose of progestins than the other 2 forms, so it would have diluted the relative risk.
I think what you're saying, Dr. B, is that since we know there's a greater than 2 times risk of these other progestins, because Depo-Provera is a higher dosage, you would expect there to be a greater relative risk. Am I right?
Right. So you're diluting the risk by having the less 2 forms of birth control that don't cause meningiomas. There's no Mirena, there's no evidence that causes meningioma. And then the underneath the skin progestin, we don't have evidence that causes meningiomas at this time.
Mm-hmm.
So they grouped those together and the relative risk was still over 2. That should trigger a study.
That's right.
You need to do something. And that's right when the generics are getting rolled out. When generics are rolled out, the pharmaceutical liability goes way, way down. And explain why Pfizer, when these medications were going generic, what would that do to Pfizer's liability?
Well, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case some number of years ago that essentially said that a case involving a generic drug is really preempted. Okay. Talked about preemption earlier. And if it is a certain type of generic, okay, an unauthorized generic, we'll call it, not authorized by the manufacturer, the founder, then there's no liability on the part of the manufacturers under certain circumstances. And generic manufacturer under certain circumstances is seen as having no liability, essentially because they say, well, wait, we're forced to use the same formula as the original manufacturer, right? In this case, when you get down to it for liability purposes, that would have been Pfizer.
Yeah, so I'm thinking more of it that it's becoming generic. It's becoming a lot cheaper. It's being a more wide use because the price has gone down because it's going generic. And Pfizer just sat there, looked at the data and did nothing. Okay, this is 2006.
Yeah, so you're talking about almost 20 years ago now.
20 years ago, they could have studied. So then the next thing that really happened was 2015, a study that identified the specific mutation that is associated with Depo-Provera. They didn't quite identify the link, but they identified the mutation that is most associated with Depo-Provera that causes multiple meningiomas that tend to be on the skull base, which are the worst type of tumor. And then 2018 was when they specifically identified the mutation that is associated with Depo-Provera and multiple meningiomas that tend to be at the skull base. And what does Pfizer do?
Nothing.
They do nothing. Okay. They do nothing. 2018, another study out of the University of Colorado. There's a brilliant neurosurgeon who's a MD, PhD. And he studied recurrence of the grade 1 meningiomas in women who are on standard birth control versus women who are on Depo-Provera. And he found that the recurrence interval was decreased in women who continued on the Depo-Provera, and that the tumors that reoccurred were bigger in women who took Depo-Provera compared to the oral birth controls. So this warning, 2025 warning that tells women and doctors, hey, if you've had a meningioma, stop the Depo-Provera. 2018 was the article that really served as the basis of that. The 2006 article was reviewing the risk of birth control medications and their potential association with gliomas, which is a type of brain tumor.
20 years ago, there was a study that came out, and that study showed gliomas and meningiomas were seen to be associated with the use of progestins. Now, that's 20 years ago. Then you have two major studies in 2018. We see that there's mutation, and they identify the mutation associated with the Depo-Provera and the meningioma. And then later, there was the determination made that if you have a woman on Depo-Provera, it's going to speed up the process, and it's going to make the meningiomas bigger.
They were more likely to develop a reoccurrence after a resection if the women continued on Depo-Provera. And having a recurrence is a bad deal, okay? Because you're then getting faced with recurrent surgery, but also radiation therapy. And radiation therapy can cause lots of problems.
If it's caught early enough and if it's in the right place and it can be operated upon, can have a successful resection. That's the type of surgery that's performed on the brain through the skull. And if you get it early enough, then there can be a successful result. What you don't want to do is have a meningioma and then stay on Depo-Provera, because if you do, then there are these studies that show, hey, you're going to have a recurrence, greater likelihood of recurrence. They're going to happen quicker, and their recurrent tumors are going to be big, right?
That's correct.
A lot of red flags.
2009 was the first article involving cryptoheptadine and the occurrence of meningiomas.
So I'm just adding them up, and I'm counting 5 or 6 studies up to 2018, right? And it was 5 more years in between that time period. Pfizer did absolutely nothing. The innovator of this product did nothing with respect to warning. And I don't even think Pfizer did any studies about meningioma and any association with Depo-Provera. However, it took other scientists had to do the study. Dr. Rowland and others had to do that British Medical Journal study out of over 100,000 women in France, right? Which then showed that huge relative risk. Was it Pfizer that did it? Was it any of the other manufacturers? No. It was a group of scientists that were not Pfizer. And so we had to have other people do what should have been Pfizer's study many years before.
Red flags. Ignoring red flags, waiting for private doctors to figure it out when these doctors are operating on glioblastomas, all sorts of brain tumors. They're busy. And it really isn't their responsibility. They just happen to be extremely smart and figure it out, okay? The manufacturer had the red flag in 2006, relative risk of 2. and they just sat on it.
Greg, I think that even before that, there were some indicators. How about the beagles?
Yeah, right. The beagle dogs and the mammary tumors associated with Depo-Provera. And the mammary mutation is shared. It's the same mutation that turned out to be the most associated tumor that was identified in 2016, and then the mutational shift that was identified in 2018. It's the same mutation for mammary tumors.
And a mutation is when a cell divides, right? It is supposed to make a complete replication or copy of itself, right? That's how the cells continue to live and how the body continues to live, right? So what happens in a mutation is that the cell divides, and then you look at the new cell, and it's not an identical copy of the other cell that just divided from. You can see what that mutation cell, I'll call it that, the mutated cell, you can see what it looks like. And what Dr. V is saying is that when we go back to the beagle dog study, even though they're not humans, versus the study where we start defining this association in humans, and the mutation of the cell looks exactly the same. Is that right?
So say we have 20 types of meningiomas with 20 different mutations that cause meningiomas. Progestins, Depo-Provera, causes these cells to multiply faster, ongoing. So you're going to have a fixed frequency of certain types of meningiomas. It could be 10 of this type, 5 of this type. So, but what Depo-Provera also does is causes this other mutation that is associated with the beagle dogs, mammary tumors, and associated with the skull-based, the meningiomas that tend to be on the skull base and tend to be multiple, which are the worst meningiomas. I'm not happy with what Pfizer has done, okay? That clearly 2018, we have clients, we have 2 filed in state court in California where they have had 1 meningioma resected and they continued with Depo-Provera, and now they have multiple meningiomas and they are not resectable. And so in other words, they have progressive disease, progressive neurological dysfunction. And we have cases that involve that across the country, the reoccurrence of brain tumors with continued use of Depo-Provera. And it's frankly sickening.
Yeah. And the doctors were not warned. Doctors weren't warned. And what that means is if the doctors aren't warned by the manufacturer is supposed to have greater knowledge than anybody, then those doctors that don't know these mutations, the studies, then what going to tell their patients? If there's no warning that, or no association, or they know of no association, not tell their patients anything about meningioma because they're not being told about the association.
I'm completely annoyed at the language in the warning. Okay. So when you think about how they state longer use reported, the doctors think of that. It could be many years, and reported doesn't mean an association, and doctors understand relative risk. So when you say reported, that makes it, anecdotal, that it might not mean that much. Okay. That's how doctors kind of read that, in my opinion. That's how I read it. I know all the literature, and the association of 5.5 is a huge relative risk. And that warning does not say that this risk is completely eliminated with oral medications. It doesn't say that. Okay. Then you look at this so-called instructions for use, and they talk about mutagenicity. And in this instructions for use, they say that they did studies involving blah, blah, blah. Okay. I'm going to say blah, 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 because that's what it is. Okay. You could always design a study result that you want. And the studies that they did showed that Depo-Provera was not mutagenic. Hey, we know it's mutagenic. It's been proven back in 2018 it's mutagenic. And they say warning, or this instructions for use, that it's not mutagenic.
Yeah.
It's a mutagen. It changes women's DNA and it causes brain tumors called meningiomas. 2 relative risk in 2006. Beagle dogs, mammary tumors. 2018, reoccurrence. 2018, changing the mutation landscape.
And by the way, a manufacturer of a drug or the manufacturer of a device without any prior authorization by the FDA, if that manufacturer sees a danger, that manufacturer can warn healthcare providers and the public in many different ways, including something that's known as a Dear Doctor letter, right? A Dear Healthcare Provider letter. They could have, in 2018 or before, sent out a letter to the doctors who are injecting this stuff, and the public at large could have sent out a warning.
What does a doctor want? Okay, a doctor wants to have the information. Okay, hey, give them the Roland article, give them the 2018 article about reoccurrence, give them the mutational shift article, and let them decide.
Go warn the doctors, go warn the patients, go do exactly what Greg's saying. Give them 2 or 3 articles.
Right, but also that the risk can be eliminated with just taking oral birth control. It's eliminated.
Tell them of these safer alternatives, right? Tell them what the risk is if you know it, and tell them what the safer alternatives are. You know what they're concerned about? They're concerned about if we, the manufacturer, warn these doctors, the more accurate the warning is, the more scared the doctors might be to apply this pharmaceutical to the patient, right? That's when it gets down to it, what the deal really is.
So here, we need to understand that this drug, okay, Depo-Provera, Pfizer, they're packaging this drug and shipping it all over the world to third world countries, okay? And, for birth control, it's not a safe drug, okay? There are other forms of birth control that, hey, if you're in a third world country, you don't want to have a brain tumor, right? How many neurosurgeons are there? They have the travel involved and the complications. And this is a public health hazard that has been recognized and identified. And this drug is being shipped all over the world. Okay, so we're going to divert to the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology.
ACOG.
ACOG. And the way ACOG is handling this debacle is that they are recommending that this discussion of what is described in the instructions for use be communicated to patients and part of the informed consent or shared decision making. Okay. So that's how they're handling it. And they have not stated the 5.5 relative risk. They have not stated this risk can be eliminated with oral contraceptives. They have not informed their doctors that these tumors tend to be at the skull base and tend to be multiple. They have not informed doctors that continued Depo-Provera will shorten the duration-free interval of tumor-free period, as well as that the tumors are increased in size.
You're going to get a recurrent tumor, and it's going to be bigger, and it's going to happen faster.
So ACOG, they're part of the problem, okay? And they've failed women throughout their history, okay? Let's just talk about morcellators. So morcellators, this is ridiculous. ACOG, when the pharmaceutical companies come up with a procedure, a medication, a device that has some sort of use that on its face might benefit women, they just love it because, they could do this new procedure, they could bill for this new procedure, but they're not looking at the science that morcellators, when you're doing an abdominal hysterectomy, they're like, wow, that uterus is kind of big. It's hard to get out of the abdominal port if you're doing it laparoscopically. So pharmaceutical companies devised a morcellator that they would be able to put through the small laparoscope and kind of disintegrate the tumor, into smaller pieces and then take out the tumor, okay? Take out the uterus, okay? And the reason why women had these types of procedures, a hysterectomy, is because of fibroid tumors. Well, you know what? Fibroid tumors have like a 0.03% risk of having a sarcoma in that tumor so that it's just a numbers game.
What's going to happen to that sarcoma if you disintegrate it? Or no, or you morcellate it.
You
You know,
morcellate-
you're basically putting a blender in there and turning on the electric blender, right?
Yeah, you're sending,
What do you think's going to happen to that sarcoma?
you're basically causing a metastatic disease, okay, and a very bad death. And you know the percentage of women that are going to be hurt. And ACOG, where's the deep thinkers? Okay, where are the thinkers at ACOG to say, hey, what about the case where we have fibroids that we believe are benign, but we take out the uterus and it was a sarcoma, and we're like, thank God we took it out because now she's not going to die of sarcoma. Where's the deep thinker, Ben? Where's the deep thinker?
I haven't seen any. Let me
in-
tell you what, it's not just Morcelator. It's not just Depo-Provera. You go way back. It's transvaginal mesh. You can talk all about these things.
Well, no, we're going to talk right now. If you're recently diagnosed with a meningioma and you were exposed to Depo-Provera or medroxyprogesterone, call us. We look at each case individually. We are filing cases both in federal court and in state courts across the country, and we evaluate each case independently.